For years, you've wanted me to tell you the stories of the Turners and to put them down on tape. It's difficult for me to keep everything in the proper context as I go back in time. And I remember additional things and stories, if you will, that should have been inserted. I've written down the stories of the Turners, their families, and their lives as I remember Mother telling me, Dad. This is February 20th, 2005. I started out with Mother. Mother was born at home in a farmhouse 20 miles from the nearest town and 6 miles from the nearest neighbor. She was the 5th child born to Catherine and named Matthew in Adair County, Missouri, October the 31st, 1907. She had 2 brothers and 1 sister that lived. Charles was the oldest. Rosie was the next. She was 1 year younger than Charles. Then the twins were born. They had a very short life. One was 2 days old and the other was 1 week old when they passed. And they were buried in the same grave. Mother was 2 or 3 years younger than Rosie, and she was born on Halloween night and said that was her only claim to fame. The youngest was J.C. He was born in 1911. He went by the initials J.C. until he joined the Navy in World War II. And they made him sign his name Jaycee. But as soon as he got out, why, he reverted to the initials again, and he was known by just plain old J.C. Matthew the rest of his life. Grandmother's name, my mother's maiden name, was Hughes. When I was 4 or 5 years old in 1936 or 1937, we got a letter from Grandma Hughes saying that Grandpa had been horned by catfish while they were feeling for them in the riverbanks. That was in the Missouri River. And the horn went in under his kneecap and poisoned him. And they were trying to get enough poison out to save his leg. Mom got worried about this, and she had Dad take her to the telephone office at LaPel. Now this was the first time I ever saw a telephone that I remember. Mom used her butter and egg money to pay for the call, and Dad made a big fuss over the cost. I can't remember how much it was. But anyway, the telephone operators sat in front of the big switchboard, and they plugged in the lines as they was called in, and the phone that Mom was using was right to the switchboard, so we all got to see and hear what they said. Well, they finally got a line into the store near Grandpa Hughes' house, and they said they'd send somebody to tell them that they had a phone call from Goldie Turner in LaPel, Indiana. And when they got someone on the phone, why, they said that Grandpa was real bad. The gangrene had set in, and they're going to have to amputate his leg above the knee. And it was kind of dangerous, and Mom wanted to see him alive. She needed to come pretty soon. Well, Dad said, well, we better go. So we loaded up the old car. I think it was a Ford. It had 4 doors and a little heater for the front seat. Mom heated up some bricks and wrapped them in some towels and rags and stuff to keep us boys warm in the back seat. It was about 450-mile trip from home to Kirksville. Well, Jimmy got car sick, and Dad stopped the car at Lebanon and got him a ginger ale to settle his stomach. And in those days, ginger ale was in a real small bottle like Coca-Cola is now. And I can remember this. I wanted to drink ginger ale too. And Dad said, no, you better wait and save that for Jimmy. He might get sick on down the road later on. Well, Mother, she said, just go ahead and wait, and she'd make it up to me when we got there. I don't remember, but I'm sure she did. Well, we stayed 2 days, and then I had to come home. It was winter time, and it was cold. And we went into Grandpa's house. There was one great big room with a stove in the middle. The bed was on one wall, and the kitchen was on the other wall, and the rest of the living quarters was on each end of the stove. And with Grandpa's leg, the way it was, it really smelled bad in there. And us boys, we put up a fit. It just stunk too bad. And so they took us over to the neighbors while Mom and Dad visited. But we got to see Grandma and Grandpa Hughes anyway. And after we got home, the letter said that he passed away about 2 days after we got home. But that was the last time we got to see Grandma and Grandpa Hughes. My mother's dad, Grandpa Name, he was quite a character. He had an unusual name. It was Name. When he was born in 1850s, it was pretty wild in that part of Missouri, and the houses were several miles apart, no stores or towns. The nearest town was about 15, 20 miles away, and the courthouse was over 30 miles away. That was the county seat, and the doctors very seldom came out that far. There's a doctor at the neighbor's farm on a house call. Well, the neighbors told the doctor that the Matthews had a new boy, a new son, and he was born on such and such a day. So the doctor said, well, okay, I'll tell him at the courthouse when I get there. And he did. He put down name, and he drew a line, and he put a blank, and he put down Matthew, and put down boy. Well, it was over 6 months or so before they got to the courthouse, and when they did, they went to the courthouse to get his birth certificate. Well, clerk had written his name in the space for his first name. Well, back then, things of that nature, were written in a great big ledger with black ink and a goose quill pen. And the story that I heard from Grandpa was that when his dad tried to get his name changed on the birth certificate to Robert, the clerk told him it would cost $25 to get his name changed on the ledger and another $25 for the certificate. And great-grandpa Matthew said, to hell with that, we'll just call him Name. So he answered to the name for the rest of his life until he passed away at the age of 94. Mother told Jim and me many stories of the farm, picking berries and gathering eggs and things that you did to survive. Well, old Grandpa Name, he was quite a man. He had been a farmer. He was a cowboy in Texas. He worked on the railroad, county roads. He was a miner, a hard rock miner, and he panned for gold. Uncle Jay told me, but where at one time, but I've forgotten. In Grandpa's younger days, he had accumulated some money. And Uncle Charlie said when he bought 160 acres of ground in Adair County, one of the neighbors told Charlie that he paid for it in gold dust and gold coins. And he wasn't too old a man then. He hadn't even started his family yet. So So he and Kate settled on 160 acres of Missouri black ground, rich and loamy soil, and he built big barns and set the house back a quarter or half a mile off the main road. Mom said it had a big drive going back to the house, out around through the barn lot, and circled around the driveway and back to the lane, half a mile from the main road. Well, I got plenty of stories to tell about Grandpa, but this here is about Mother. My mother's about 12 years old, not quite 12. Why, her mama passed away. Kate died. And that left Rosie and Mom and Charlie and J.C. Well, Charlie ran away and left the farm for good. He didn't like to work. He liked to gamble. And Grandpa named hired a man and his wife to stay there on the farm. The man was to do Charlie's work, and the woman was going to take care of the house. Well, her and Aunt Rosie didn't hit it off too well, because she was 14 or 15 years old, and she knew it all, and she didn't want to take orders from this woman, so she ran off with old Vern Dole to get married, 14 or 15 years old. Well, Name took off after him with a shotgun. He was going to shoot old Vern, but he couldn't catch him. And they didn't stop at the courthouse in Missouri. They went clear on into Iowa and got married in Iowa there. And J.C. told the story that Grandpa Name said he was going to shoot old Vern, but he couldn't take time out from the fields just to kill a rat. So Charlie and J.C. called Rosie's husband Rat Dole. And this aggravated Aunt Rosie to no end, to say the least. And she said she finally forgave J.C. for doing this, but she never did forgive Charlie, because she said Charlie was the black sheep of the family anyway. And the sad part of that is she was right. He was the black sheep. Well, when Rosie ran off, Name told Mom and J.C. that they could stay with some friends of his and Kate's in a little town called Novinger. Well, this was a long lane back there so they could go to school. Well, this was a long lane, and Mom and J.C. would ride all the old mare down at the end of the lane every other week or so. The neighbors would come and pick them up, and then it'd be Name's turn to take the kids to school. But they'd just turn the old mare loose and let her go back to the barn, see. But J.C. said he thought it was more or less that he didn't want to take time to school than anything, see. So he just said, well, he'd let them stay in town. So they did, and this was an elderly couple, and they liked it there, and they're good Christian people. And Mother said that they went to school. There's a Mennonites, German Baptist or Amish, but they called them Pennsylvania Dutch, because they had another settlement in Pennsylvania. Was at this school, and they would let the girls go to school there, some of them, but she got to be real good friends with one of these Pennsylvania Dutch girls. And so this was one of the best friends that Mother ever had, she said. And these Dutch, they're very good people. And that spring, they were going to take a wagon train to go from Adair County, Missouri to Pennsylvania. And they wanted Mom to go with them. Well, Grandpa, she said, well, we'll have to ask her dad, you know. And so this couple didn't know about it. And so they had a big prayer meeting over it with the Dutch and everybody. And Grandpa said if the people she was staying with, I can't think of their names, said thought it was all right, why she could go to Pennsylvania. So they was going to take this wagon train, and they were sending the equipment, the horses and the wagons, and a lot of livestock ahead. And then, as soon as they got settled down and some buildings built, why, they was going to come back and get the families, the rest of the train, and take another train back to Pennsylvania. So this couple said Mom and JC could go, and so they was all set. And they said that they'd take JC if he wanted to go. But JC said no, he didn't want to go. He said they did too much praying to suit him, so he wouldn't go. But anyway, Mother stayed in Pennsylvania until she's almost 16 years old. But after her 16th birthday, she said they wanted her to join the church and to stay there. And said one of these young guys there, he was wanting her to get married, see, after she joined the church. Well, she said she wasn't too hot on that. Said she told him that she wanted to go back and see her daddy. So they were going to send people from Pennsylvania back down to Dare County and bring another wagon train back to Pennsylvania Dutch settlement there in Pennsylvania. So she said, well, she was going to go back home, and she did. And so they was going to help, this other train was going to help these people find their way to the other settlements. But anyway, she said she was glad to get home, and my mother, she's just always full of stories about life in Pennsylvania, about the barn raisings and the home buildings and the way they lived their life. And they all had homes next to their mom and dad. And the old man, he owned all the ground. And so when the boys got married, they picked him off an acre or so of ground, and they put him a house on it, a barn, and moved his family in there. But the ground still belonged to the old man. Everybody worked for the old man. Well, so they had a big communal eating place, and all the families ate in one place. They ate their breakfast, and they ate their dinner, and they ate their supper there. And the women, they'd get up about 5 o'clock and start fixing breakfast. The men would get up and do the chores and get the horses all harnessed up and ready to go to the field. And Mom, when she first got there, she just laughed, and she said she thought that was the prettiest thing, because of a morning, while all these horses would be lined up along the fence right out there in the barn lot, maybe 8 or 9 teams of horses lined up, ready to go to work, and the men be in there ready to eat their breakfast, and set all them horses out there and harnessed up and snorting, ready to go to work. But she said after she'd been there a while, she figured out it wasn't quite all that much fun, because after the horses left and the breakfast was over, why, the girls and the little boys, they had to go out there and pick up the horse apples and put them on a cart and take them back to the garden and use that for fertilizer on the garden. Mom said they had very few flowers, which she missed in Missouri. They had dogwoods and things in Missouri. They missed the trees and everything. And she always said it was a real good time in her life. She had plenty of good friends to talk to, and plenty of praying to God to help her be good. And she was going to bring us boys up the same way, whether we liked it or not. But Mother, she learned a lot from the Dutch, and she could make all kinds of pastry, cookies, and cakes, and all made a lot of cream and sugar, and her pies were delicious. About Mother's pie, people always said that pie's as good as Mother makes. Well, a lot of that is because when you were young, anything to eat was good, because we was always hungry. But Mother cooked on a wood stove, and the first I remember, that stove was a big old kitchen stove with a tall back. And the oven was under the firebox. And we had 2 or 3 metal wire shelves in that oven, and according to whatever you wanted to cook, well, you had to put the food on the right shelf. And if you put it up too hot, why, it burnt on the hot. It burnt it, and if you put it too low, it didn't get cooked. So Then when the fire burned down, you had to add more fuel. And before the stove got too hot, you had to take the pie off the top shelf and put it in the middle of the bottom shelf. Just keep so the heat would be adjusted. And by moving what you were baking, you could get it cooked through and through. And it was hard to get fruit pies cooked because they had to be on that top shelf for 4 or 5 minutes to get everything cooked good. And by the time you moved it back down to the bottom shelf, back up the top shelf again, why that crust was burnt black. And there wasn't much help for it. And so the first thing us boys would do is be to break that crust off and give it to the dog. And we used to tease Mom and said we didn't know pies weren't supposed to have burnt crust until we went to school. And but teased Mother, she always didn't appreciate that too much. But Mom, she was an excellent cook. And after we moved up to the big house, why, she had an electric stove, and Mom said she was in hog heaven. She could make Danish rolls, strudel, and all kinds of cakes and pies, and the crust on these pies were really incredible. The yeast rolls, biscuits, and flavored cream, sugar, molasses, honey, and cinnamon, nutmeg. She cooked all the Dutch dishes and seasoned them up good. These were the dishes that she learned when she was a girl in Pennsylvania. And she taught me to cook several kinds of food, meats and cakes and so forth, but always with a word of mouth. She never had anything wrote down, and she'd say, Billy, use 6 cups of flour in that and 4 whole eggs, and I'd put her in there and I'd stir it up real good. But I sure wish that I could remember some of the recipes, but we never wrote anything down, so it's all gone, and they just can't remember. So it's back to the early days of the family again. I'll talk about Daddy for a little bit. Joseph W. Turner Sr. Now, Dad was a good dad. He had a big load to carry. Right after the Depression, 1929, why, money was real hard to come by. But Dad, we always had food on the table. And Daddy started out as a city boy, but he moved to the farm at the age of 3 or 4 years old. He was born on March the 5th, 1907, Charles Nancy Turner. He was the youngest of 9 children, born to Nancy and Charles. Tony was the first child, and then his Walter, and Roy, and Mildred, and Gladys, and Hazel, and then Joe. And there were 2 more children in there, in between Roy and Mildred, I think, but that didn't make it. Uncle Tony moved to Idaho and farmed and ranched. One of his boys became a minister and had a church in Indianapolis for a while. And he had four boys. Walter stayed in Kirksville and ran a lumber yard. His wife, Pauline, came to Indiana after Walter passed away. He died in 1975, about 2 years before Mother died. Pauline came out and stayed with Dad for a while, stayed about a year and took good care of him and kept him on a diet and made sure he took his medication. And he had a pretty good life while she was here with him. But she had to go home because for medical reasons, and she passed away in 1979. She was 78 years old, born 1901. They had one child, a girl named Helen. Now Roy, he had 13 kids, 13 children. His wife's name was Mildred, and his children's story would fill a book. I'll tell some of them sometime later. There was Mary Margaret and Marina and Lavina. They was twins. Tommy and Charles and Darrell and R.A. and B.J. and the other kids, I don't recall the name. But out of the 13 kids, 13 children, 5 boys were killed in accidents involving automobiles and booze. Roy also had one boy that paralyzed from the waist down and another crippled. Did all from car accidents. Well, Mildred, she married Alvis Mason, and they had 2 boys, Ronnie and Jerry. Alvis, he worked for the osteopathy school, medicine, for years, and he retired there. And Mildred was a teacher. She taught there. Hazel and Gladys, they never married. Gladys and Hazel stayed and took care of Charles and Nancy. They ran a grocery store at the south end of Osteopathy Street there in Kirksville, Missouri, and they made a pretty fair living. And they passed away in the 80s. And that leaves Dad. He was the youngest of 9 children, and they nicknamed him Babe. Everybody said, much to Jimmy and my delight, that he was spoiled rotten. He always denied it, but he had to grin. Now, Dad only went to the 8th grade, but he was very mechanically inclined. He got him a job, quit school, at the local shoe factory when he was 14. And he met Mother at a church social and found out she worked there too. They both worked there until 1927, when Mom came to Indiana to the Church of God convention in Anderson. The lady that brought Mom out to the convention was a woman that she moved in with when she came back from Pennsylvania and helped Mom get a job at the shoe factory. And she run kind of a little boarding school for girls there. And so there were 5 girls, including Mom, driving a Model A Ford, 450 miles from Kirksville to Anderson, Indiana. The lady's name was Stella Dugan. She was the nearest thing Mom said to a mother that she ever had. And they stayed at a boarding house owned by Ori and Quincy Gothard near the convention center. And while they was at the campgrounds, they heard that the Remy brothers were hiring people. So Mom and Joyce took a bus down to the factory and applied for jobs, and they were hired. Report tomorrow, 18 cents per hour. In a 10-hour day, they could make $1.80. They were making 90 cents a day in the cutting room at the shoe factory in Missouri and was working 10 to 12 hours a day. Well, boy, they was going to get rich. So after the Church of God convention was over, Mom and Joyce decided they was going to stay in Anderson. They was going to work in Anderson. And this was in 1927. And Stella, the lady that brought them out, made arrangements with Mom and Dad's family after she got home. Now they didn't even know they was going to stay till after Joyce got home. And for Mom and Dad to stay at Orrin Quincy's boarding house. So they stayed there actually for a year or so there at the boarding house and worked at Remy's. Well, after Stella got home, 2 other girls came back to Anderson on a train. And they boarded Gothard's too. And their boyfriends were going to drive out from Kirksville, Missouri, because they told them about the big money they was making in Anderson. And Mom told the story many times over the years, but I've forgotten the names. There were 5 boys that made the trip. Dad was one, A.C. Combs was another, a boy named Floyd Auker, A-U-K-E-R, that was Mom's boyfriend at that time. And there was a Harold, too, and I can't think of his name. But they all got jobs at Delco Remy's and stayed. Well, 1 or 2 went back to Missouri. Dad later told the story that they had 13 or 14 flat tires on the way out here. It was all gravel and dirt through Missouri, but got better through Illinois and Indiana. Now, Dad came out here to see one of the girls that came to the train. And Floyd came out to see Mom. And over the time, Dad and Mom started going together, and Floyd and Dad's girlfriend started dating. And A.C. Combs married Joyce, and Dad married Mom in 1930, and Floyd married Dad's old girlfriend. I forget what her name was. But anyway, Mother and Dad bought a house in Meadowbrook in Anderson. And the times were hard. The only way it worked, if you wanted to keep your job, you bought a house in Meadowbrook. The bosses and the foremen had the last word on who worked every day. If there were only so many jobs that day, when they were filled, everybody else stood outside the gate waiting. They waited for somebody, the foreman, to come out and say, well, we need somebody else to come in and work a while. And they'd come out, pick 2 or 3 people out of the crowd, and you'd come in and work for 2 or 3 hours or whatever, but at least put bread and milk on the table. Well, the guys that did the hiring had a racket going. They built Meadowbrook Edition. And small houses close together in rows and streets and so forth, and sold them to people that worked at Delco Remy. And if you bought a house from one of these bosses, he'd make sure you had enough work, at least enough to make the house payment. See? Well, Mom and Dad wasn't no dummy. They bought them a house, and they worked right on through the worst part of the Depression. You didn't work much. They made enough to make a living. Well, Dad and Mom's first house was on Ringwood Way. The address is long gone. The house didn't last that long. I got pictures of it when I was young and in there, and the house was deteriorating real rapidly right then. And I wasn't even a year old. And the Ringwood Way, the street is still up there in Meadowbrook. Now, Mom and Dad had a good relationship with their landlord. He was also their general foreman, see? And they lived in that house there until I was born in 1932. Mom quit Reeby's to take care of me, and they sold the house. Dad said he lost several $100s on that. And they moved to an old farmhouse out on Layton Road. And I was about 6 months or a year old. There are pictures of me on that farm when I was about a year old. James Lee was born May the 5th. I got that birthday wrong. 1934 at St. John's Hospital in Anderson. I was also born at St. John's. I was the first Turner in the family to be born in the hospital after they moved in Indiana. We stayed at the Layton Road home until about 1935 or 36. And Dad rented a small house in the country from Short and Busby for $7 a month. It used to be a schoolhouse sitting on the south side of the road across from where Ethan May Cloud now lives. It's the first house east of the family farm is where we stayed for several years. In 1937, Dad bought 40 acres west of the rented house. He put up a shed, got a milk cow, some pigs, and went into the farming business. Dad was a worker. He was fly to build, but he could work all day, sleep a few hours, and go in the factory for his shift. He went in at 3:30 and got off at 1. He'd be up doing something by daylight, and he taught us boys to do the same thing. 1937, he started to build a new house on the 40 acres. Is that still recording?
Yep.
In 1937, Grandpa came out to help build the house. And Grandpa lived in a little trailer camper. It looked big to us boys, but it couldn't have been more than 12 or 14 feet long. And he slept out there and had all the secret things grandpas have, you know, in there. And he took his meals out to the trailer and ate outside when he could. Jim and I thought that was pretty neat. Grandpa was a good carpenter, about all the woodworking and everything, and the hardwood floors, why, on the house he did. And if Dad built something he didn't like, why, he'd do it over when Grandpa was out the factory, or Dad was out the factory. And Dad didn't like that too much, especially if Mom wanted it done different, and they would fix it like Mom wanted. However, Grandpa did good work and didn't cost Dad too much, so he grumbled at Jim and me, but he didn't say much to Grandpa. Now, the site where the house is now standing, the old farmhouse, there's a small rise in the ground where Mom wanted the house. There is to be a full basement, 11 blocks high. Grandpa and Dad, started digging it out with a team of horses and a slip scoop. If you don't know what a slip scoop is, it's a steel box about 14, it's about a foot high and about 40 inches across. And it has a front end open and a cutter bar on the edge. The tongue where the horses is hitched is hinged on the scoop. So when the scoop is full of dirt, the horses pull it to where you want to dump it. You have to lift the load by two long handles on the rear of the scoop until the edge bites in and the scoop will flip over, dumping the load. It's hard to flip the scoop back over. It's pretty heavy, and you had to be sure to let loose of the handles or it'd send you flying into the back of the horse's hooves. I was about 7 years old at that time, and I learned my lesson pretty quick. My Dad would drive the horses down the grade and fill up the scoop. At the top, Mom would drive the horses where we wanted to dump it, and then Mom would get on one handle, and I'd get on the other handle, and we'd dump her over. And I'd drive the horses back for another load. Grandpa had another team down in the hole, flying out and loosening more dirt. Took most of the summer. After the hole was deep enough, we had to dig out the ends of the slopes. The horses drug the dirt up. That ground was so hard the pick could bounce on it. Grandpa said Dad would get him some dynamite, he'd loosen it up damn quick. But Dad went over to the stone quarry lapel and bought a case of dynamite, some caps and some fuses, and Grandpa was in business. He knew what he was doing. He bored some holes, put the caps and fuses in the dynamite, and was ready to shoot her off. Well, Dad told Mom to take the horses down to the end of the lane and tie them up. Well, she did. Well, however, when the blast went off, the horses broke their ties and ran off down the lane. Well, they turned east down towards Ethan Clouds where the barnyard was, and when they got to the gate, the old mare who was on the left-hand side, she turned in, but the horse on the other side didn't. Well, she was the heaviest and swung him around. The slip scoop was still hooked up. One horse went on one side of the corner post and the other went down the other side. Scared everybody to death. Just stripped that harness right off there. But if you lost a horse, it's just like one of the family. See? We all run down there, and they was all scratched and bruised up, but never broke anything. Well, it tore the harness all up, and Grandpa taught us boys some new cuss words. While he repaired it, and Dad bought another set of harness at the sale barn, but Grandpa went ahead and fixed the old one. And later on, he had the harness oiled and flexible as new. Said it took a quart of each foot oil to get it in shape. And he told Mom, try not to mess this set of harness up. And just grinned at us boys. She just gave him a dirty look. And it tickled Grandpa. Shut it off. Grandpa, he sure knew how to shoot the dynamite. He had those corners square and the walls straight. And when it came to lay the block, they said straight and square. And that sure made Grandpa grin. Well, Dad took the dynamite and the fuses and put them in the old chicken house and put the caps in a glass jar and put them in the shed. But that's another story. I'll tell that later. Now, you turn it off. The winter of 1937 was one of the worst winters for years. The snow covered the north side of the house. Now this is the house where Ethan Cloud's living now. Clear up to the top. I mean to the very top. Now Jimmy, see, we weren't very old. We was only about 5 and 4 years old. And we could take our sled clear up on top of the house, and we could slide for miles. We could slide from the house clear on down so far we couldn't hardly get home. And the snow had a heavy wet crust, and then it froze. And Dad and Mom and Grandpa dug a tunnel from the back door to the barn. Some of the pigs froze, but the rest of the animals was okay. They built fires under one of the big kettles, big old lard kettles, and Jim and I would fill it with snow and melt it for the cows to drink, because we had the well was at the house, see. And so we'd melt this snow for the chickens and the calves and the horses. And some of the chickens, they stayed in the barn too. It wasn't cold in there. The animals, they put out a lot of heat. But we'd take each cow a bucket of water, and when she stopped drinking, we'd go on to the next cow. And they learned real quick to drink as long as they could, because when they quit drinking, we'd go take the bucket away. So they drank just as hard as they could drink. Well, Jim and I couldn't go through the tunnel unless Grandpa or Mom went with us, because there's at least 8 feet of snow over that tunnel. And Mom was afraid that it's collapse and suffocate us. But anyway, when the storm started, Dad, he went to work as usual. We didn't have a radio. We didn't know all this was coming in. And we didn't have any standard warning of what was going to happen. And now the Mills girls, Anna and Sybil Mills, lived on down the road. They worked at Remy's. And Buck Wise, he lived on down past where the old Layton place was. He worked at Remy's. And Roy Shively worked at Remy's. He was the next house up where Glenn and Layton lived, the first house west of the farm. Okay. Well, they all lived west of us. Down the road's now 150 in. Well, Dad, he got home. He put tire chains on in the parking lot. He'd been in Missouri mud before. He knew what to do, and he had to have tire chains with him. And he put them tire chains on. And he bragged for years and years that only he and 3 or 4 other guys got out of the parking lot. And he said they followed him or they wouldn't have got out. And he was right too. But anyway, Ann and Sybil Mills, they followed Dad almost back to the door of our house. See? But Roy Shively and Buck Wise, they got stuck further on down the road. They never made it. And I think Roy went on home. He lived in the next house where Layton had lived when you was a kid, you know. And but Buck Wise and Ann and Sybil, they stayed until the storm was over the next day, see. And then they walked on the ice over the fields to get home. Well, it was quite a winter, and it was quite a spring too. When the ice melted, the floods came, this was before the road bed and what is now 600W was raised. The water was 10 feet deep from the Hamilton Road clear across the Hamilton Bridge. It was 10 feet high on the old steel bridge. And there are marks in high water marks on that bridge when they tore it down in the 70s, 1970s, 1960s when they tore that bridge down. And I was going to go down and take pictures of that, but they got the bridge knocked down before I could get down. But we could stand on the road there at Hamilton, where the grocery store was, where Benefield's grocery store was, and it was water from there clear across the river, 10 feet deep. And it just looked like the Mississippi River. It's even hard to see where the other side of the river was. But anyway, all that water around the walls on the new basement, the mud and water built up around that wall in the basement, caved in. The whole west end of that basement caved in. And we were just all sick. Daddy borrowed a pump, pumped out all the water, Of course, it's mud. I mean mud, 4 feet deep in there. And Grandpa started digging a drain, but it was at least 7 feet deep to make an outlet, and it took till midsummer to get the mud out and the blocks cleaned up. And Dad started laying the blocks himself because we didn't have enough money to hire it laid. But they got the blocks laid up, and the house and the outer walls were tile brought from a tile factory, and I know where that place is. It's still south of Rushville, and I think they still make tile there. But anyway, Dad and Grandpa got the roof on and the doors and windows in the next couple years, in 1939 and 40, and they had it about ready. And by this time, Grandpa taught me a few things about sawing and hammering, and also a few other things the boy should know. And there's a few other good stories too, and things he said, now don't tell your mom this, and so we didn't. But well, they got the house built in 1941, the year the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor. We were in Sunday school when the preacher stopped and looked back towards the back door, and Orphy Busby was standing there, and they lived across the road from the Beale Chapel Church there, and said that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor and our lives were changed forever. 1941 was not a good year. After the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt declared war on Japan on December the 8th, and Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December the 11th. So we declared war on them too, and the war was on. But I'll tell more stories about the war later. Delco Remy, as it's now called, went into full war production. They built heavy-duty starters and generators for tanks and airplanes, and heavy-duty generators and coils in Plant 4, regulators and coils in Plant 6, and Plant 1 and 2 were for administration and payroll and so forth. The motto at Delco Remy was a round logo, and in the middle was Delco Remy. And right outside the side perimeter of that logo was the slogan, "Wherever wheels spin or propellers turn, Delco Remy." That slogan was seen all over the world. In my later years, after I got a job at Delco, it pleased me when people would repeat that slogan where I told them where I worked. Dad finally got a job in skilled trades during the war. He was very happy when he came home and told Mom he was a die repairman in the tool room. He would make a lot more money, too. In 1942, Jim and I had our work cut out for us. The old barn, it was a shed actually made out of Remy lumber, the loft for hay, was still across the fence from the house we rented from Busby. This meant to get the chores done, we had to go about a quarter of a mile west, there across the field. Actually, it was about 100,000 feet across there. And we still did our milking in the old barn. So we had to bring the milk back across the field, carry it down the basement and strain it. Some we put in a separator to take the cream off, and the strained milk we put in cans and sold to Davis Dairy. Mom used the cream to make butter. Grandpa, he didn't stay too long after we moved into the house. Said he was going back to Missouri. J.C. came and got him, and he took all of his things, a lot of his things, tools, loaded them up, told Mom and Dad goodbye, and take what was left. If you want to do anything, burn the camper. Well, Dad moved it up to the new place, and Mom kept chickens in it for a while. It was always sad to see chickens when Grandpa used to sit looking out the door. And while I'm thinking about the cows and cream, I remember Grandpa carving a butter mold for Mother. he held a pound of butter and had a removable bottom. And he made it out of one piece of wood and carved pictures on the side. The top of the mold was much wider than the bottom, and the bottom had Mom's initials on it, upside down and backwards, and looked like looking in a mirror. And when she pressed the butter in it, it had GT on the top of it. And she told the story that the man at the creamery gave her the same price as everyone else. He didn't tell her that some people wanted the butter with initials on the top, and he was selling her butter at a higher price. One day the huckster truck stopped at the farm, and Mom had some butter on the table with the initials on it, and the huckster man dealt with the same creamery man that Mom did, and he knew that he was buying low and he was selling high. So he told Mom, he said he'd buy all her butter for 20 cents a pound. So she sold it to him. And Dad said the creamery cheated her for years and sold the cream, started selling the cream to Davis Dairy. Dad used to grin and say, "Go easy on the butter, boys. She's 20 cents a pound." We always thought he was kidding, but I ain't too sure. Well, after Mother passed away, I remembered that butter mold, and I asked Dad if I could have it, and he said he sold it to an antique dealer for $20. I told him, "Dad, I'll give you $100 for that." He didn't believe me, but he didn't know where she was or where she's from. It's sure been great to have Mother's old butter bowl with her initials. That her daddy carved for her. Well, we started moving that old barn piece by piece. We put it north of the house, down over the hill. Mom said she'd rather carry milk up that hill than to have that old eyesore at her back door. We got it moved, put it up again, and we was back in business. I think I was 11 or 12 years old when Dad bought the barn in Aroma. It was north of Perkinsville, about 13, 14 miles from home. That old barn was 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, 2 stories high, and a hip roof on it. My Dad marked every beam and brace with a steel tag on it and made a print out of all of it. We tore that barn down, moved piece by piece, 13 miles down the highway. We had about 5 miles to go down State Road 37. We had some beams 40 feet long to move 13 miles. Dad took a wagon apart and we fastened rear wheels to the one end of the beams and 40 feet down the other end, put the tongue in the wheels. I was driving the old W.C. Alice Chalmers pulling this contraption. That's what the state policeman called it when he pulled me over. Scared me to death. The only piece I ever saw was in the movie. I told him a story, and Dad was behind me in an old truck, and I was going to turn off the highway at Scotty's Inn. Told him it was the only way us poor people could ever get a barn. He said, "If you're going to put this barn back together," and I told him we sure were. Dad got there, and the cop asked him what he thought we was doing. Dad told him he was moving a barn. He asked Dad if he's going to put it back together, and Dad said yes. He said, told Dad to keep it off the highway. Go ahead, wish you a lot of luck. Well, we moved about 2 or 3 more long loads, about 30 feet long, but we used rubber tires on it and went like hell till we got off State Road 37. We put that old barn up before I was 15 years old. Norm Seal laid the blocks. Dad built a crane to raise each bent. The bent is a cross section of the barn, the width of the barn, 20 feet high. It's quite a feat for a man and 2 boys, but we got her done. At one time, that old barn held 2,000 bales of hay and 37 milk cows, all milked by hand twice a day, forever. Jim and I'd get home from ball practice and go to the barn and milk those cows every night. Someday, Mom, God bless her, would have About half of them milked when we got home. We was always tired from playing ball. And boy, we sure liked that. We wish we had shown a little more appreciation at the time. We still had a lot to learn.